Well, thank you very much, Firas, for inviting me, and thanks to Conrad as well for organising. And I'm very mindful that the theme of this series is manuscript provenance beyond Europe, and so I am going to try to get as quickly as I can to Aleppo, the setting for my talk. But I'm going to start with a quotation from 18th century Europe, and I hope that my reasons for doing so will become clear. If I can. This is from volume 5 of the English historian Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, where Gibbon is about to launch into the story of Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam. And in one of his famous meandering footnotes, he sets out his sources, writing, "Before I enter on the history of the Prophet, it is incumbent on me to produce my evidence." And there follows a long list of Latin, Italian, French, and English Oriental scholars of the 17th and 18th centuries. But Gibbon finishes by naming two Arabic language historians whose writings very much underpin the account of Muslim history which Gibbon sets out in The Decline of Fall, the Arabic text of Abu Fida and al-Janabi, the first an enlightened prince who reigned at Hama in Syria 1310 to 1332, the second a credulous doctor who visited Mecca Anno Domini 1556. Well, the name of those, or the first of those two authors, will, I'm sure, be familiar probably to Firas, certainly to Conrad, and no doubt to others of you. Ismail Abu Fida, who lived 1273 to 1331, the Mamluk era governor of Hama in Syria, an author of a geography, the Taqwim al-Buldan, a sketch of the countries, and a history, Tariq al-Muqtasa fi Akbar al-Bashar, an epitome of the history of mankind, written between 1315 and 1329, and based for the earlier sections on the Kamel of the 13th century historian Ibn al-Athir. And Abu Fida, both as a geographer and as a historian, was well known in Europe already by the 17th century. The name of the second, I suspect, although I might be wrong about this, will be less familiar. This is a man called Mustafa al-Janabi, who died either 1590 or 1591, an author of the 10th, 16th century, who lived at least for a time in Aleppo and was the author of a work usually referred to as Tariq al-Janabi, extant both in an Arabic version and in a Turkish abridgment prepared by the author. And that raises two immediate questions, which are firstly, how did Gibbon know about this relatively obscure work, the Tariq al-Janabi? And secondly, why did he use such a source in his history of the origins of Islam? And I shall return at the end of my talk to the second question, but I can answer the first one quite specifically, and that is that Gibbon learned of it via a French scholar called Jean Garnier, who had emigrated to England from France in the early years of the 18th century, where he worked in Oxford and where he produced a French language history, La Vie de Mohammed, published in 1732, in which he drew frequently on al-Janabi's Arabic text. In fact, Garnier's manuscript survives today in the Bodleian Library, his translation of al-Janabi's Tariq. And Garnier knew al-Janabi through a manuscript, again, now in the Bodleian, which had come to the library at the end of the 17th century from the collection of the English scholar Edward Pocock, and as far as I know, was one of only two of the Arabic versions of this work which came to Europe in the early modern period. The other one is also in the Bodleian, and which had been acquired in Aleppo earlier in the century by the figure about whom I want to talk this evening, a man who has been known to the few historians who've come across him as the Dervish or Darwish Aḥmad. Well, who was the Darwish Aḥmad? Well, we know about this figure primarily thanks to his work in Aleppo on behalf of several European book collectors. Edward Pocock, whom I've just mentioned, who was in Aleppo in the 1630s as a chaplain to the English merchants in the city, and who would go on to become the first professor of Arabic at Oxford, and Jacobus Golius, who was in Aleppo in the mid-1620s, where he served the Dutch consulate as a secretary, and who later became professor of Arabic at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And a series of letters from Aḥmad to Pocock survives in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and here's one of them. And these letters are full of fascinating details about Aḥmad's effort in searching for, copying and buying books in Aleppo on Pocock's behalf. There are also at least 4 letters from Aḥmad to Golius, 2 in Leiden, here's one of them, one in Manchester, and another which I'll say something about later, which survives only in a copy now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And these letters were edited and preserved during their recipients' lifetimes, Golius's and Pocock's lifetimes, as curiosities. The letters to Pocock were known to his 18th century biographer, and they've been used by authors writing about the history of early modern European Oriental studies. Peter Malcolm Holt, who translated parts of the letters to Pocock in the 1950s, Gerald Toomer, who used them in his 1996 History of Arabic Studies in 17th Century England, and Hilary Kilpatrick, who has written on them in a fascinating article as a rare specimen of private correspondence from 11th, 17th century Syria. And indeed, I was able to use them in my 2020 book, A Commerce of Knowledge, to try to reconstruct Pocock's work as a collector in Aleppo in the 1630s. But what I want to argue here is that these letters and the various other manuscripts, notes and colophons attesting to Aḥmad's work tell us much more, or tell us about much more than the history of European collecting and scholarship, and are in fact a window onto the production and sale of manuscripts in Aleppo in the 17th century. And that they might possibly, I'll suggest, tell us something more about Ottoman Aleppo's intellectual culture, something I hope of value to historians of the Middle East. Well, I've referred to my protagonist so far as the Dervish Aḥmad, which is how he always signed himself in his letters, as you can see at the bottom left-hand corner of the slide here. But as far as I was able to, by searching in the colophons of the various manuscripts which Aḥmad copied, I tried to find out a little bit more about him. And so this is the fullest version of his name which I was able to find. This is from a copy by Aḥmad of the Divan by Al-Mutanabbi, copied in 1631, in which he's signed himself Aḥmad al-Kamasihi. I'm not entirely sure of that word, but that's how I transcribe the word up here. Aḥmad al-Kamasihi al-Gulshani al-Halabi ibn al-Hajj Hussam ad-Din Allah al-Qasmawi. Again, I wasn't entirely sure of this part of the name, but al-Qasmawi is what I made of that. He was evidently a native of Aleppo. This is his copy of the treatise on the so-called plagiarisms or thefts of Al-Mutanabbi by Abu Sa'id al-Amidi, where he adds to his signature al-Halabi Baladan, i.e. Alpine by city. And here, more explicitly in another colophon, this is his copy of the Tanwir Saktazand, a commentary on the poem The Saktazand by Abu al-Ala al-Mari, copied in 1634, where he writes al-Halabi Muwalladan, i.e. Alpine by birth. He was a Sunni Muslim of the Shafi school, which was traditional for Syrian Muslims. Here in the former colophon, he's signed his name as Shafi Madhaban, i.e. Shafi by school. And he was also very likely to have been a Sufi associated with the Tekke or Dervish lodge of the Gulshaniya. You can see here that he's also added al-Gulshani tariqatan, i.e. of the Gulshaniya Dervish order. And this, I think, enables us to link him to the written history of 17th century Aleppo. Ahmad's contemporary, the historian Abu Wafa al-Urdi, devoted an entry in his biographical dictionary to a certain Ismail al-Gulshani, who was evidently a charismatic sheikh and noted Quran reciter, and was the founder of the Gulshaniya Lodge in Aleppo, which was located close to the citadel. And it's just possible that Aḥmad made one very brief appearance in the histories of his native city. Both al-Urdi and al-Muhibbi, another contemporary historian of Syria, tell the story of a dispute over the question of who ought to be appointed as the rightful successor to the head of a Sufi order founded in Aleppo by a man called Aḥmad al-Qari, following al-Qari's death in 1632. And in at least one version of this story, the man who loses out to a rival claimant is named as Darwish Aḥmad al-Gulshani. Well, that's a little uncertain. The naming's a little uncertain. Annoyingly, the name is given slightly differently in the two printed editions of al-Urdi's biographical dictionary. But his connection in some way with the Gulshaniya order is quite certain, I think. Well, in addition to these links to the Sufi order, Aḥmad was also heavily involved in Aleppo's book trade. And my guess is that this overlapped in some way with interests in the city's broader commercial life. Ottoman Aleppo, as you'll know, was an important center for the silk trade in particular, and it was that trade ultimately which had carried Europeans such as Pocock and Gorlias to the city in the 1620s and 1630s. And it's clear from Aḥmad's letters to Pocock that he was acquainted with the English consul in Aleppo and with at least one of the English merchants. He was also, as we learn from one of his letters to Pocock, familiar with the porter, that's I assume what he means by al-Jawish, and with the cook, Tabakh, the English consulate. And Aḥmad's letters to Gorlias also mention a connection with the porter, this time using the Arabic word al-Hamal of the Dutch consulate. We know too that Aḥmad was married. He tells Pocock this. And we also know, at least according to one report, that at some point he served as a governor or tutor to the sons of the Druze emir, Fakhr ad-Din al-Ma'an, at Sidon in the Lebanon. And I'll return a bit later to that possible connection with Fakhr ad-Din. He also taught Arabic to at least two European visitors to Aleppo, and he appears to have served not only as a copyist and as a broker, but also as a kind of intellectual guide to Europeans into Arabic literary traditions. So I'll say something now about the general impression of the book market in Aleppo conveyed by Aḥmad's letters and by the reports of his work, which I've used to reconstruct his activities. The primary way, at least as we perceive it in Aḥmad's letters, of buying books throughout the 17th century appears to have been at auction. And the first thing that strikes us from Aḥmad's reports, I think, is that this was a market which was highly competitive. Already by the 1630s, there was a handful of European collectors who were clearly driving up prices in Aleppo, but that's certainly only one part of the story. One testimony which is often cited from later in the 18th century is that of the Scottish physician Patrick Russell, who was in Aleppo serving as a doctor to the English merchants, who complained that that affluent Ottoman merchants were forcing up the prices of books. Here's a variation of what he says in his famous book, The Natural History of Aleppo, in a letter to the then professor of Arabic at Leiden, Jan Jacob Schultens, in which he wrote, "The worst is that at the sale of books here in Aleppo, it often happens that some of the rich Turk merchants interfere, who from the mere affectation of having a library purchase the books at any cost, which they then immediately lock up and very seldom can be prevailed on to admit of copies being taken." And this, at least Russell thought, had forced the sheikhs, who, he says, used formerly to be almost the only bidders at auctions, out of the market. And Faras's 2018 study of the Maronite physician Hana al-Tabib lent some weight, it seemed to me, at least to Russell's impression that the demand for books was increasing among the non-religious professional classes in the 18th century in Aleppo. And yet there's certainly some evidence that this entry of a wealthy mercantile class into the book market had occurred earlier in the 17th century. One report drawn up by another of the European collectors active in Aleppo, the missionary Father Celestine Petros Golias, tells of a certain Persian merchant who in the summer of 1637 spent the extraordinary sum of 4,000 gurush in buying up a private library of manuscripts. Aḥmad also frequently complains of the bitter competition he faced from a rival Aleppine collector, Muhammad al-Taqawi, a noted adib who, as Benedict Ryer has recently shown using al-Taqawi's inventory now in Gotha, owned a private library of more than 130 volumes rich in adab or literature, history and medicine. And one example related at some length by Aḥmad is when he tells of the bitter struggle with al-Taqawi over a copy of the Rasa'il Ikhwan as-Safa, the Epistles of the Brethren of Purity, a miscellaneous encyclopedia of the sciences produced in the 10th century. And the dispute, which Aḥmad refers to interestingly as mukhasama, suggesting perhaps not only a quarrel, but possibly some form of legal contestation, was only resolved by the intervention of Muhammad Najmuddin al-Halfawi, the Khatib of the great mosque of Aleppo. And this manuscript, which I suspect is now the richly illustrated copy of the Rasa'il Ikhwan as-Safa, now catalogued as Lord Orr 260 in Oxford, fetched, Aḥmad reports, the remarkable sum of 60 gurush. In fact, the prices of manuscripts mentioned by Aḥmad further attest to this sense of fierce competition. He pays 24 gurush for each of the 2 volumes of Aḥmad ibn Ali al-Kalkashandi's secretarial manual, the Subd al-Asha fi Sinat al-Insha, 22 gurush for the Hayat al-Hayawan, Lives of Animals, the zoological encyclopedia by Muhammad al-Damiri, 30 and 35 gurush respectively for 2 different copies of the Amthal or Proverbs compiled by the philologist al-Maydani. And it's worth noting that these prices compare, in fact, very well with those cited by European collectors of the 17th century buying books elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. However, set beside what we know of the typical cost of books in 17th century Syria, these prices were very high. Colette Etablé and Jean-Paul Pasquale's 1999 study, for example, found the average price of manuscripts sold at Damascus between 1686 and 1717 to be just 2.3 gurush. And Boris Liebrenz has found that manuscripts in Syria during the 17th and 18th centuries tended to fetch a steady rate of between 1 and 3 gurush. And it's possible, at least, that the rarity or the extraordinary quality of the manuscripts bought by al-Gushani, such as this copy of the Rasa'il Ikhwan as-Safa, explains their high cost. However, it's perhaps more likely that this simply reflects a markup on the sale of books to European collectors. Well, the second point to make is that whereas Aḥmad's letters certainly reflect the rich market for books in Aleppo, familiar from other sources, most famously the Ottoman scholar Haji Khalifa Khatib Chelebi, what we also see is that Aḥmad is searching for manuscripts further afield, most notably at Damascus. And in the report he gives of his quest for the Rasa'il Ikhwan as-Safa, for example, he mentions writing to friends at Damascus where the library of Fakhr ad-Din, who had died in 1635, had recently been sold. And Aḥmad had apparently seen a copy of the Rasa'il Ikhwan as-Safa in the Emir's library. And this adds nicely, I think, to the picture sketched in Boris Liebrenz's talk a few weeks ago, where he described the movement of books outside the well-known trajectory of books coming from the provinces to Istanbul. In this case, it's clear that the copy of the Rasa'il Ikhwan as-Safa came from Damascus to Aleppo. And at least one copy of the work, as Benedict Ryer was able to show from an ownership mark, ended up in Muhammad al-Taqawi's library. Well, what kind of books are we talking about here? I've mentioned a few already, the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa, the Hayat al-Hayawan, also interestingly owned by Muhammad al-Taqawi, and al-Kalkashandi's manual. And in Hilary Kilpatrick's article, which I mentioned earlier, there's a very helpful appendix listing all of the books mentioned in Aḥmad's letters now in Oxford. And what I've been able to add to this is a further list of more than 30 items which Aḥmad acquired in Aleppo for Pocock, and which Aḥmad evidently drew up for Golius. The explanation behind this, I think, is that Golius asked Aḥmad to do this in order to keep tabs on a rival collector. Now, obviously, these books reflect, to some extent, the priorities of the European scholar, but, and especially by comparing them with the books in al-Taqawi's library, I think it's fair to say that they also give a very good snapshot of what one could find on the book market in Aleppo in the early decades of the 17th century. So the first point to make about these books is that literature, adab, and literary criticism seem to have comprised a very important part of this market. Among al-Ghulshani's acquisitions were many of the canonical works of the Arabic literary tradition. Ibn al-Muqaffa's Qalila wa Dimna, an Arabic adaptation of a series of Indian fables, the Hamasa of Abu Tamam, the hugely influential anthology containing many pre-Islamic verses, the Diwans, poetic collections of al-Mutanabi, Abu Ala al-Mari, and the Egyptian Sufi Ibn al-Farid, and the Maqamat, narratives in rhymed prose interspersed with poetry of al-Hariri. Aḥmad also acquired commentaries on all of these poems, as well as Salah ad-Din as-Safadi's al-Ghayth al-Musajjam, a commentary on the Lamiyat al-Ajam, the famous qasida by al-Tughra'i, written in the 11th, 12th century, and commentaries on Sa'di's Gulistan, a series of moralizing tales in Persian verse and prose written 1258, Dawood al-Qasiri's and Alwan al-Hamawi's commentaries on Ibn al-Farid's al-Taya al-Kubra, a long mystical allegorical poem on the religious seeker's quest for selfless love. Ibn al-Hajjaj al-Haytami's commentary on al-Busiri's al-Hamziya, 13th century ode on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and a further unnamed commentary on the Mu'alakat, an anthology of pre-Islamic qasida. So all of these works, both canonical works of literature and many works of literary criticism, are among the books acquired by Aḥmad. And in fact, nearly all of the manuscripts I've found in Aḥmad's own hand are works of literature or literary criticism. I've shown the colophons to some of those already, and here again is Aḥmad's copy of an anonymous commentary on Abu Ala al-Mari's Diwan, the Saktazand, copied in 1634, and you can see the sample of the text on the right in Aḥmad's hand, and on the left the colophon with his signature. So that's literature and literary criticism. In Aleppo, it was also clearly possible to acquire very good quality dictionaries. Aḥmad bought both the Siha, the lexicon compiled in the 10th century by al-Jawhari, and the Qamus of al-Firuzabadi. He also, interestingly, bought several unnamed lexicographical works in Persian and Turkish, and this seems to confirm what we learned from several other sources about the polyglot nature of Aleppo's book market in the early 17th century. Geography also appears to have been a particular interest of Aḥmad's. One interesting item on the list of books he acquired is a copy of the Kitab Nuzhat al-Mushtaq fi Kitirak al-Afaq, the book of Pleasant Journeys into Faraway Lands by al-Idrisi, 12th century geographer. And if, as I strongly suspect, this is the illustrated manuscript now catalogued as Pocock 375, which it's only possible now to view on a very bad microfilm, so I don't have a photograph of it, I'm afraid, then this would be further evidence of the movement of books across the Ottoman Empire. This particular copy of al-Idrisi's geography had been produced in Cairo in 1553. Other manuscripts on the list relate to history, El-Janabi, to which I will return, medicine, an abridgment of Ibn al-Nafi's Materia Medica and a commentary on the same work, algebra, philosophy, and astronomy. Here you see one of the astronomical works. Aḥmad acquired the Zij al-Sultani astronomical tables by the Timurid governor Ulugh Beg, which has an interesting note on the title page, indicating that this manuscript once belonged to a certain Sheikh Mustafa al-Halabi, who purchased it for 7 kurush in 1032, that is 1621 to 1622. And here's the second astronomical work Aḥmad mentions, Abdul Rahman ibn Umar al-Sufi's Kitab Sawa al-Kawakib al-Thabita, the book on constellations, produced in Aleppo in 1703, 1303 to 1304. And you can see here that among the various notes on the title page, there's a further note linking it to Aleppo. You read the name of a former owner called Abu Bakr ibn Uthmaniyah, who notes, adds to his name, al-Halabi at-Tabib, the Aleppine and the doctor. So that's astronomical manuscripts purchased in Aleppo by Aḥmad. Well, those different subject areas to which I've just referred correspond quite closely, I think, to the topics represented by the books in the other library list we have from 17th century Aleppo, Muhammad al-Taqwi's library. And the other interesting correspondence between those two, Aḥmad's list and Muhammad al-Taqwi's library, is the lack of theological books. Nowhere does Aḥmad mention having bought a Quran. The 3 theological books he does mention reflect his background as a follower of the Shafi madhab, the Tafsir al-Jalalain, the commentary of the 2 Jalals, the Quranic commentary by Jalaluddin as-Sayuti and his teacher, Jalaluddin al-Mahali, the Minhaj al-Talabin, a popular work of Shafi jurisprudence by al-Nawawi, and a commentary on al-Nawawi's work by al-Mahali. 2 further items which I'll mention because they seem to me rather surprising. The first, Aḥmad describes simply as several commentaries on the Torah, i.e. the Hebrew Bible. وَأَخَذَ, he says, مِنْ تَفْسِيرِ التَّوْرَةِ كُتُبْ مُتَعَدِّدَةً, with no mention on whether those were works in Arabic or in Hebrew. The second, he does specify as a Hebrew version of the Maqamat. And my guess is that this is a reference to the 50 Hebrew Maqamat composed by Yehuda ben Shlomo Harizi, an author of the 12th, 13th century in Spain. And that's interesting, I think, because it shows some overlap between the market for Islamic and for Jewish books. And Aḥmad, as I've suggested, as a Sufi, was certainly not unaccustomed to dealing in Jewish books or indeed in books on Christianity. Okay, well, finally, I want to return to that question with which I began, which was, why did Gibbon use this relatively obscure author, Mustafa al-Janabi? You'll remember, a writer of the later part of the 16th century, as a source for the origins of Islam in his decline and fall. When I set out writing my book, I was concerned with setting out a particular kind of argument, which was to show how European Oriental scholarship was shaped decisively by the very particular concerns in which European Orientalists encountered the learned traditions of the Islamic world. And my story about Pocock and Aḥmad in Ottoman Aleppo was part of that broader narrative. And however, in the course of writing the book, it occurred to me that the question might be asked the other way around, i.e., what insight can these snapshots preserved in the work of scribes and dealers like Aḥmad and the manuscripts they copied and the manuscripts they bought tell us about the intellectual cultures of the Islamic world, in this case, the intellectual life of Ottoman Aleppo? The topic that interested me particularly was history. What kind of historical books did Muslim scholars in Ottoman Aleppo read? Were the works acquired by Europeans, Mamluk chronicles such as Abu Fida's Mukhtasar, and comparable Ottoman works like al-Janabi's Tariq, representative of the kind of books valued by the Ottoman literati through whom Europeans acquired their knowledge of and their access to Arabic literature. Muhammad al-Taqwi's library suggests indeed that this was the case. He owned, as Benedict Ryer discovered, Abu Fida's Muqtasar, and Benedict noted the prominence among his collection of history books from the 13th to the 15th century from the Mamluk lands. And so it's in this context that I turn finally to Aḥmad's acquisition of the work eventually known to Gibbon, al-Janabi's Tariq. Aḥmad reports in one of his letters that he was working on the transcription of al-Janabi's Tariq, a part of which Pocock had seen in Aleppo, and that the finished copy of which Aḥmad promised to deliver to the English consul. However, the manuscripts that eventually reached Oxford were not evidently copied by Aḥmad himself, but had been pawned to or deposited with, at least that's how I understand the verb here, rahana antim, for the sum of 27 gurush by a man named Mustafa al-Ra'i in 1046. And my guess is that Aḥmad borrowed the 2 volumes from this man with the intention of copying them, but ended up sending the originals to Pocock. Now here I should thank Gerald Toomer, who in a very generous and very insightful review of my book pointed out that there was another copy of al-Janabi's Tariq in the Bodleian among the Laudian manuscripts, and that it was possible that that manuscript was the one transcribed by Aḥmad. And that seems to me certainly to be at least partly correct. Here's the copy of al-Janabi's Tariq in among the Laudian manuscripts. You can see at the bottom Archbishop Laud's signature and the date 1638. And this, I think, is pretty clearly in Aḥmad's hand. But interestingly, it seems to me that this hand breaks off midway through, beginning at the section on the life of Muhammad and resumes in a different hand. And there's a further mystery in that volume 2 of the same work, now in the Bodleian Laud 232, the continuation of the work up until al-Janabi's own lifetime, has a colophon clearly indicating the name of the copyist as the same Mustafa al-Ra'i, presumably the same Mustafa al-Ra'i who pawned the other copy to Aḥmad. So that, I'm afraid, remains something of a mystery, in that I haven't been able to find out who this man Mustafa al-Ra'i was, or indeed why his books ended up coming to Aḥmad. But it points, I think, to the point which I'm trying to make, which is that all through this report, both in the accounts Aḥmad gives of Pocock seeing the manuscript in Aleppo, in this story of it being copied by this man Mustafa al-Ra'i and then by Aḥmad himself, and in various ownership notes on these manuscripts, and the various copies of these manuscripts now in Oxford, all points, I think, to the value in which this work was clearly held in Ottoman Aleppo. And that's indicative, I think, of the point I've been trying to make throughout, which is that these snapshots of copiers, the work of copiers like Aḥmad, point us deep, in this case, into the intellectual interests of Ottoman readers in Aleppo, in this case, a particular interest in this rather obscure work of 16th century history. And the case I would want to make is that these collections preserved from the 17th century can really be used to extent I'm not sure they have quite yet, to show us something of the inner workings of the intellectual life in cities like Ottoman Aleppo. So there I'll finish. I hope I've stuck to time, and thank you very much.